Hello everybody and welcome back to another Tuesday API review. If everything goes after plan, then today we should be done with our backlog for 7.0, but we will see. I don't want to jinx it too much, but it's always good to have a plan. So the first one, I think it's either Ryan or Christoph, if I remember correctly.
Hey, it can be me. So basically, C# has added the required keyword support recently, and because of that, we've added internal support for the required properties in JSON. And since we already have a support, we can as well expose it. And basically, the proposal is very simple. So there is one is required member on the JSON property info metadata, which tells you, okay, this property is required, and also matching custom attribute JSON required attributes, which basically means if you put that on the property, then the default JSON type info resolver will map that into that is required on the metadata model.
Christoph, can you help me understand why is the attribute required rather than just using the required keyword in your code?
Yes, so actually there is some differences on that, and I have written like a tiny thing in the other issue, the required keyword. I believe there is a link somewhere to the other issue. There is a proposal in there, like how is it different specifically, but basically the idea is required keyword can be cancelled when you put sets required members attribute on the constructor, and it only cancels the effects of the required keyword for that when that specific constructor is used. So, and because our metadata model has a create object property which user can set, we cannot actually reason what like if that attribute is there or not, because we don't talk about the constructor, we talk about like how user wants the object to be created, and because of that we cannot one-to-one map required keyword into the JSON model, and the JSON required basically is exactly matching the model. So the required.
So if someone wants to define a type that they both use and that is JSON serializable, they have to make their property both JSON required and required?
No, so the required on so the default logic will be following. So if the property has a required keyword and the constructor we by default will use doesn't have the sets required members attribute, we will map every single property or field mapped on the JSON into the property which has the JSON, like basically the property will be required. There are some exceptions in how that differs with what compiler is doing. So another difference is, an example, like if the options is ignoring fields completely, but the specific class has required keyword on the field, we will not actually enforce that field because we don't know about it. So there's nothing we can do basically on the contract model. Like we would have to basically check all of the fields and or always fail the serialization. Basically, this model doesn't one-to-one map in the with what the JSON users would expect. That's my understanding. I hope that answers the question, Steve.
I didn't, maybe partially, I didn't fully understand. Can I paraphrase to say the vast majority, I mean, that the constructor option that you were talking about is considered, Fred, correct me if I'm wrong, it's considered like the 5% escape hatch. So the 95% case is someone's just using the required keyword. And if they're just using the required keyword, everything just works. Yes.
I might even say it's lower than 5%.
Okay, great.
Yes, so it will just work, but the exception is if there are two constructors, there is a default one and something with the arguments, and say the default one has the sets required members attributes, and now actually let's do opposite.
Sorry, so forget sets required. If sets required isn't used at all,
If
The
sets
required
required
keyword
is
just does the right thing.
Yes, yes, correct.
Okay, so the JSON required attribute is only to help with the 1% case or whatever the sets required constructor thing is.
It's not exactly. The difference is also with the fields, as I said. So there are scenarios where how do you explain it? So basically, like the fields will not be considered for the. So, I mean, I guess you could say that there's a one-to-one mapping, but in a sense, like every property which is considered for the serialization of the serialization will be like and has required keyword, and the sets required members attribute is not used. That will be one-to-one mapping.
You're saying the attribute also is applicable to fields, whereas the keyword is not.
Keyword is also applicable to fields, but we might not necessarily consider fields for the deserialization. Because like by default, we actually ignore all of the fields for the serialization.
So I'm lost again. I'm sorry. If I'm the only one, we can move on. But the on a field, are you saying if I put JSON required on a field, that makes it required even if fields are ignored even if fields are otherwise being ignored?
No, no. No, I mean, in a sense, it is equivalent, but like, as I said, the only difference is like when someone starts customizing create object on the type info resolver. So like if you have two constructors and the parameterized, say you have the parameterized constructor and the non-parameter, like the parameterless constructor. And if parameterized one has a JSON constructor attribute and sets required member attributes, and the default one doesn't have the sets required members attributes, and someone changes that create object into the parameterless one, at that point we will completely ignore the required, like we actually won't ignore, and we, sorry.
So I understand the sets required member special case.
Yeah.
I understand why you have the attribute for that case. I'm trying to understand the other case you were talking about with fields.
The fields is kind of to just showcase that we are not one-to-one mapping with what the compiler requirements are. So basically, like if you try to instantiate class which has required keyword on the field, then at that point, like you will get the compiler error. While in case of the deserialization, you won't get that.
Why won't you?
The reason why not is because we don't know about the field at all in the contract model.
But why would the JSON required attribute change that? Couldn't we
So
look
the
for
JSON,
the required? Couldn't we look for the required member attribute on the fields as well? It seems like just a different name for an attribute.
Correct. I mean, we do look at that as well. I mean, the current implementation at least. But yes, as I said, like if someone changes the constructor, I mean the JSON type info.create object, then at that point we don't know like if that specific create object has sets required members attribute or not, and we cannot reason about the required keyword at that point.
But again, you're talking about sets required members.
Correct.
Forget sets required members for a moment. I understand that case.
Okay, fair enough. So yeah, if we forget about sets required members attribute, then there is a one-to-one mapping.
Okay, so JSON required is only to overcome issues with sets required. So it's only expected to be used by like whatever the 1% of usage is.
Aren't required properties technically not supported in .NET Framework?
Correct.
So
like
this is
all
also
the-
a .NET Framework Net Standard 2.0 feature.
Yeah, and a couple of points I already put in chat is, languages like F# don't have a required keyword yet, so they would be able to benefit from this attribute. And I would say that It kind of makes sense for certain cases to mandate that a property is required from a serialization perspective, but not from a language perspective. So all in all, I would say it's a useful addition for a small subset of cases.
That's fine. I'm just trying to understand the usage of it and the overlap with this prominent new feature in the language.
So yes, like if we only talk about the newest version and we completely forget about that escape hatch, then there is a one-to-one mapping. But if we consider also other languages and that specific attribute, then at that point they become, there are some nuances where they work differently.
I think that's fine. I think my primary concern is similar to Steven. It's like when, imagine you write idiomatic C# with the latest version of C# and you put required in the, as the modifier on the member, right? I think what we want to avoid is that people have to do that and then also put the JSON attribute on it, because at that point it seems like you're repeating yourself, right?
Or think that they have to. So
yeah.
Part of this might be being very clear in documentation and IntelliSense and whatnot about when you need this.
Right. I think to me it makes sense to say if you're not using the latest version of C# or you're not using C# at all, then the attribute adds value. And then in the context of C#, you would say the only place I would use the attribute is for what Eric just said, is like you just don't want it required at the language level, you just want it required at the serialization level. That makes sense. I still don't quite understand how that plays with the other attribute, but that might also be because I don't quite understand how the C# version of that just plainly works. Do we need a Boolean at all on the JSON attribute, on the JSON required attribute, to say no, this is not required?
I mean, the lack of presence of that attribute means it's not required.
Yeah, I was thinking like serialization when you have it required in C#, but you want to say it's not required for serialization.
That seems pretty weird.
I would hope it is, but it's kind of like the...
I mean, it's a fair question when you look at the Newtons of JSON APIs. So they actually have they implemented slightly differently. They have a JSON property attribute, and that one is required, or is it just required? And it's actually an enum, and which have a couple of flags, which are basically two combinations of it's required or it's not required, and like how do you behave with the null values. So that's basically for combination of those two flags. So it's a fair question, I guess, but it doesn't seem to be relevant in this particular scenario, unless we want to talk about the null values, which currently we will assume that null is treated exactly the same as any other value. There is nothing special about it. So
basically, if something is marked as required, then
yep.
Basically, from a JSON serialization standpoint, you would say it's okay if somebody has the property in the payload but is explicitly set to null.
Yep.
That would be the
don't
same as C#, yeah.
Yep. Like technically, we could solve that in the future. So we already have a should serialize predicate, and we could technically add something like should deserialize to match that, and that could maybe filter out this kind of behaviors if someone wanted, but that's out of scope for now.
Right, that makes sense.
I should call out, I've put in chat, but I don't know if people are looking at chat, like MVC has actually had this concept for a while. This, like, you must deserialize something, anything, even if it's the empty value to this property. And there are scenarios for it. I've put links in chat. So it is viable, I think.
Did we say why the data annotations one isn't good enough?
The data annotations one talks about the value itself rather than the fact that you've bound the value. So in data annotations, like it would forbid null, and by default it also forbids the empty string. Whereas in MVC's scenario and in the scenario that is presented here, like it's legal to bind null and the empty string because you have explicitly said in the payload, I want these.
Yeah, I'm also a bit hesitant to support random other attributes from other namespaces, because then it's like, why do we support required but not the other 1200 that are in there, right?
Yeah. Just in case like people didn't have a chance to check out the links I put in chat, like the canonical example of the required attribute, like bind required as MVC calls it, isn't really on string types, it's on value type members. So say that you're trying to bind an age, or say that your type exposes an age field or a GUID field or something like that, where those are value types, right? They'll end up with default of T if you don't bind anything to them, but default of T is almost certainly not what you intended to have. So the idea is you put the required attribute on those to say, hey, if you really did want default of T, the payload had to say that explicitly.
Right.
So it's the argument that you could just use like component model data annotations validator at that point to make sure values that you need to be non-null or non-default are that way?
Well, you don't need it to be non-default. That's the thing. Like it is legal to have an all zero GUID. It's just like that had to have come in via the payload. You don't want simply instantiating the object and the fact that it simply backed the field with zeros. Like if someone fails to bind that coming in, like you want that to be an error because they have failed to set effectively a required property on the type.
I think they're talking about two different things here, though. One was basically the validation behavior when something is marked as required. Does it mean that it's legal when the payload explicitly says property name : null? Or do we say, no, required means non-null? And the C# behavior is, it doesn't mean that required just means you have to write an assignment, but the assignment can be for any value, right? And our serializer would have the same behavior. It would just say, you said required, so you better have the field in the payload. What you're setting it to doesn't really matter as long as it's valid.
Right, and so data annotations doesn't actually participate in the binding or object creation process. Data annotations is intended to run after the object has been fully populated.
Right.
So it doesn't know if a value has default of T because the value was simply never initialized or because it was explicitly set to that via the wire.
Yeah, that's also true. I think, yeah, the other question is, should JSON serialization honor data annotations at all? And my honest opinion is, if you want to do that, then we better have an explicit configuration to opt in. But then I would also say we should support all of it and not just some, oh, we honor required, but we don't, honor the, max length, for example, on a string, right? That would be like either we support data annotations or we don't. Otherwise, I would just be saying, okay, if you want to change the serialization behavior of your types, you use the JSON attributes for that. I think it's weird if we randomly pick existing attributes from other technologies and then say like, oh yeah, we have this jagged support matrix of like, we support these two and those two, but not the other six. And then at that point, it's like, how do you author your type? And I think it's easier to have a simpler story that says the only thing you have are the JSON attributes and whatever the language, idiomatically supports, right? I think
with data annotations also, because it's expected to run over the entirety of the object model, generally it would be the very last thing that you do after the entire model has been rehydrated. So right. For instance, like JSON, not JSON reader, but the very low level component that JSON serializer is built on top of would not be the right place to put data annotations logic anyway. If we were to include it, it would be in JSON serializer itself, not in the underlying infrastructure.
You're basically saying it's basically almost like a callback, right? At the very end, you just say validate myself, right?
Yes, the stuff that Christoph is presenting here is much lower level than where data annotations normally plays into the pipeline.
Yeah. And presumably people can do that already, right? We already have, I think, a callback that is invoked on the root object, in which case you could add a call to whatever the data annotations API is that validates yourself, right? But that would also be some reflection, I suppose, right? So I guess if we really wanted to make this great, we would also have to support probably source generation for the validation logic, which we probably don't want to do right now, at least.
Yeah, I'll let Christoph speak to the point where the appropriate plugin place might be, or Eric.
Sorry, I missed the context. Can you repeat the question?
If somebody did want to plug data annotations into the system, maybe is there a callback at the very, very end of deserialization of the entire graph where they get the object graph and get to party on it before it's returned back to the caller?
So yes, there's an on the serialized, I believe, on the property info. It was recently approved. So also if the specific object implements, forgot what the interface was, object deserializable, something like that.
Okay.
JSON on deserialized.
Yeah, something.
Yeah, so
along the
that
lines.
would be one place to do it then.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right, then. Are there any other more concerns? Shape, naming. Presumably, it's not inherited, right? The attribute.
It is not, because it's only on property and field.
Well, properties can be virtual.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and I can never remember what the default of inherited is. I think it's false, but I don't make sure that I think multiple is default to true, and I think inherited is false.
I thought it was exactly the opposite.
Then I don't know. Then let's just be explicit here and just say we intend multiple faults and inherited faults, right?
So one thing that MVC did in their API shape is they also allow you to put required on the type itself, which automatically flows down to every single member on the type. Yeah, but that's why if you did want to allow that and you needed to support overriding for some reason, that's where true and false would come in.
Yeah, exactly opposite email. Inherited is true by default, and allow multiple is false by default.
Good. This is why it's good to be explicit.
Does this mean that under the current design, it's not possible for an overriding method to disable the property being required unless going via metadata?
And by metadata, you mean attributes as opposed to
So
C#?
So metadata meaning going through the JSON type info metadata and disabling the is required property. I believe that under the current design, you wouldn't be able to inherit a class and override the member saying, oh, actually, you're not required anymore in this derived type.
Well, I think if you
That's
say
Even if you're
That's correct.
deserializing as the inherited class and you put the attribute on the inherited class?
That would be the other way, Stefan. That's the derived type could say it is required when the base didn't. So.
Yeah, the
Sorry.
C# feature does not let you remove requiredness at a derived type. It only allows you to add it.
And I think if this attribute can't be popped off at a later thing, somebody can come up with a feature proposal and we'll fix it then. But
Yeah, we could always extend it to have like true false semantics in the future if we wanted to. That shouldn't be a breaking change.
So for the Newtonsoft thing, is that inherited? Because like normally,
Newtonsoft has a JSON property attribute that has a required property, so you can set that to true or false. We have followed a different design where we have bespoke attribute types for every knob that is configurable.
Yeah, I think the question is if you have a base type in Newtonsoft JSON where you put a JSON property attribute on it, and then you derive from the type, presumably the behavior of the properties is inherited from the base, or is it not?
right, that's the question. If it's not an inherited attribute, it's not, right? Unless you do extra work, but maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, my assumption is if we say inherited false, then effectively you get to you're expected to restate. Yeah, I guess I don't know exactly how inherited works. I assume that inherited would only imply for virtual properties that you actually override, right? So anything that you don't
non-inherited. Sorry.
Yeah, I think if you have if you just let's say you have a person type, right? It has a first name and a last name property, right? They're non-virtual, let's say, right? You just have a constructor that takes them. and then you extend person with, let's say, employee, then unless these properties are virtual, when you actually go for reflection and you ask the property for its attributes, it would still give you the same attributes because the declaring type is the base type where they actually lived, right? So I think the inherited comes only in if the property is virtual and you effectively ask the derived type, the derived type's definition of that property for its attributes. If inherited is false, then it will only return what the override effectively said. If it is inherited true, then it will effectively combine them. That's my understanding of how inherited works for attributes. So I think for the most common cases where somebody just extends types, inheritance doesn't really matter. It only kicks in when things are virtual. And I think at that point, I would honestly prefer the model to say inherited false, because then, well, you get to restate all the attributes. If you want to override some behavior, you just change it. If you want to keep the behavior, you just copy and paste everything from the base. And if we don't want to have that behavior, then now we would have to come up with a mechanism to override, right? Which basically means our property here, our attribute here, would have to have a true-false attribute, right? Or true-false, constructor, effectively, to say, no, my base is required, but I want to be not required, right? Versus in the other model, you just don't repeat the attribute.
Okay, so that's not how it works in new and soft. And like, conceding your point, of course, about like, okay, it only matters if you override. Like, I think that's going to break expectations. Like, I don't think people are going to expect the JSON required attribute to be like dropped just because they overrode a property and like didn't decide to reapply the attribute. Like, I get that it's trickier since we don't have the is required, and now you can't like override it and say, no, I don't want to require it. I'm not sure how important that is, but I think it's confusing not to have the attribute inherited. It does not do what the new and soft one does.
Yeah, so I think let me take a look. I mean, to me, the question is more like, how do our other attributes behave today, rather than how does Newton's JSON handle that? Because it doesn't make sense to me to say this attribute would be inherited and the other ones wouldn't be, right? And I think the other ones are... so it looks like the other ones, none of them set inherited, which means what Fred said earlier, they would all be implicitly inherited, right? So I guess in that case, I would say let's just do what behavior is for the other attributes. If they're all inherited, then I guess this one is also inherited.
Right, completely agreed. And that's why I think attributes default that way as well. Like, that was also my assumption going into this.
I guess then that makes sense.
Yeah, so then I guess based on that, we revisit like whether we need the bool. Like, I don't know how common it is to like want to unrequire something in an overridden class.
I mean, we don't really have this for the other ones, right? If the base test says JSON ignore, you can't re-include it either, right? So I guess that's just the general behavior of our attributes, that they're not designed to be overridable like that.
Yeah, I mean,
you can always go to metadata.
To be fair, like whatever default we will pick, it's possible to write a modifier for the type info resolver which changes that to whatever desired behavior we want.
Yeah, I mean, I understand, but that's kind of a very steep cliff now, right? Because you're saying like, you can use attributes for everything except when you can't, and then you have to write custom logic to handle it.
I mean, I think that there are enough escape valves already in the system that taking what we have, or taking what's proposed and shipping it and waiting for people to complain is the right answer.
Yeah, I think that's also true. I don't think we've seen any complaints about the lack of overrideability, so I would say then let's wait until we see evidence for that. But that was kind of what I tried to ask earlier when I said, do we need a bool? I just did a really bad job of explaining why I thought that might be necessary. So then this is it, right?
Ship it.
On the JSON property info, does this thing need to be virtual or no?
No, I wouldn't think so.
No.
Oh. That's why I can't find it. Yeah, so nothing is virtual in that type today, right? It's all just pure data holder. Looks as proposed. I guess that's always a true statement. All right, then done with this one. Rename rate limiter async.
Again. Yeah, so this came up in API review a couple weeks ago. And we basically renamed wait async to wait and acquire async, which is quite a mouthful. We accepted it because we thought wait async was confusing. We were like, well, is it clear that you're actually getting any permits when you're not, providing the overload, or are you just waiting until you can ask to call acquire and stuff? So last time on API review, we approved for the, I'm going to call it non-blocking, non-async version. We just called that acquire. And then for the async version that actually kind of waits in line for the rate limit lease, we called that wait and acquire async, which, while clear perhaps, is not convenient. And then the major thing is we expect most customers, most users of this rate limiter API are going to want to wait in line and call what we called wait and acquire async. So we wanted to give that a better name. Basically, we really wanted to call that acquire async. The problem is we didn't want to call the non-blocking version acquire because it's not the same as, it's not like just a blocking version of acquire async, which the name acquire would imply. If we called acquire async, which we are with this proposal. So after some discussion in the comments, we think attempt acquire communicates this kind of best effort nature where it will see if there are any permits available right now, but won't wait any amount of time for that to happen. Tove had some very interesting ideas about trying to make the blocking and non-blocking, or sorry, the async and non-blocking versions more similar by adding a timeout to the non-blocking version, which would make it blocking if it was non-zero. Interesting, but way harder. It would require more design than just this rename. And I do think this is an improvement, so I don't want to lose kind of the better naming.
So in terms of usage, do you think attempt acquire is used frequently, or do you think the 90% case is acquire async and then attempt acquire is kind of an advanced thing?
I think it's the latter, that the attempt acquire is kind of advanced. I mean, so far, the main thing that we've written is the middleware, which the rate limiting middleware in ASP.NET, and that does not call what we're proposing is renamed as attempt acquire.
So wouldn't the whole purpose of the rate limiter to say that the client is requesting too much and you want to smack them down? So you waiting should be rare. You should never want to wait. You should say you've exceeded your capacity, go away, and then you should close the request.
Well, let's take HTTP rate limiting for example. Ideally, the client will look at the for whatever it is, slow your roll status code, and then there are also headers, right, which will tell you retry after and so forth, and that'd be great, but not every client does, and sometimes just holding things up in the request queue is the better way to apply back pressure, because the client will wait for the response, so having it sit in the queue is convenient. So in practice, right, even the what was called wait and acquire async has a limit for how many things will wait before it too will just return a failed lease, and if it's too long, right? But this is all configurable.
We don't have try acquire because the rate limit lease has a representation for the lease failed, right? There's no point in the bool with an out, right?
Right, exactly. like in the case of attempt acquire, like there's no real concept of not getting a lease, but there is a concept of getting an unacquired lease that might have that metadata that you might use for like a retry after header or something.
Yeah.
As long as they have different names, I don't really care.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the only thing I don't love it about it is like trying not to talk myself out of an API. It's like, yeah, even acquire async to the point, since there isn't like an infinite line can return non-acquired release, but that was also true for way and acquire async, which like I think they're both kind of unclear on that point. So we'll just have good doc comments. But yeah, I discussed this with a large amount of the ASP.NET side of the team. Like there's at least like a half dozen of us who agree this is better. They're not all like in the this meeting. They assume that like I would be able to manage hopefully a simple rename. But yeah, that's about it.
I mean, I don't really have any feedback. I'm kind of in Jeremy's camp as well. Like as long as the names are different, I think I'm fine with them. Yeah, my gut feel is always have the simpler name for the more common case, and I guess acquire async is a simpler name than attempt acquire, because people I think kind of understand what async as a suffix means. So realistically, the only method name is acquire at that point. So I guess that works. Is this the last review though, or are we trying to rename it a few more times?
Well, I would like to promise it's the last review, but like Tobe did bring some interesting things up about timeout, so like no promises. But this is certainly in the right direction. I don't know.
Then let's not spend more time, because it seems like we will spend more time on it.
Yeah, let's not. Yeah, thank you.
Seems like it will come back eventually. All right. Creating a temporary directory.
Yep, I can take this one. We currently have 2 APIs for working with temp things in path. One of them is get temp path, which gets you the path to the folder that's like your temporary directory. So like on Windows, it's your temp environment variable where that points to. On Unix, it's your tmp dir, or if that's not set, then like whack tmp. And then we also have get temp file name, which actually creates a temporary file with a random name in your temporary folder and then returns you the path. And there's a lot of cases where people want to create a directory inside their temp folder for working with temporary files, like kind of in one place. Like a good example is like they have a helper method to get the temporary directory, and then they call that helper method in many different places and add a new file in there. On Unix, there's a system or a POSIX API called makeDtemp, which does this, which creates you a uniquely named temporary directory. Just like the make-s temps that creates the temporary file.
Right.
But on Windows, we don't have like a system API to do this, but we would just kind of simulate it somehow. Like I threw out using a new GUID as an option, but it's guaranteed to create a brand new directory each call to this method.
Right.
And so that's kind of the background. At first, I had proposed it to be in the same line. The naming I proposed at first to be in the same vein as get temp file name, but I really didn't like. I don't like get temp file name already because it creates you a new file every time you call it, and so I did want to break the consistency here and call this method create temporary directory or create temp directory, whichever. There's some open questions as well. If you scroll down to the alternate, open questions. Like optionally taking a prefix, if you wanted to like prefix your directory for some reasons. I know like ASP.NET does this with some of their temp files. They have like an ASP.NET Core prefix. And then the second and third ones are more about the shape, like directory.create directory returns a directory info and not a string. But since I'm proposing this to be inside of path, path doesn't do anything with like file info or directory info. I'm kind of proposing it to return a string and not a directory info because it's in path. But then that kind of brought up question number 3 about like, well, would this be better inside of directory.create temp directory? But my answer to that one is like all the other temp things are in path. So putting this near those 2 existing ones feels better.
Yeah, I mean, I
agree. Yeah,
I think I would lean more towards following the existing naming convention and just call it get temp directory and then just document it similar to get temp file name that, yep, this actually creates this thing as well. And just
so my concern with that email, that was actually my initial thought as well. But then when I saw it written out, I think it's very likely people will confuse that to think that it returns the temporary directory path.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think if it said get temp subdirectory, then that would be more obvious that it's not just returning tempter.
Yeah.
But I do think that get temp file name made a mistake because it's not getting it's creating a file and it doesn't convey that. And so I actually like create temp subdirectory. So use create instead of get. And then I don't personally care between path or directory, and don't personally care between returning the directory info or the string. But I think create has value. Temp instead of temporary, because a temporary directory sounds like it might be erasing itself, like our temp file collection does, and then instead of directory, subdirectory, to make it just more clear that it's not the temp directory.
I like subdirectory. I think that's a good change.
I think to me, I just dislike the symmetry between files and directories. Would anybody really oppose if we add create temp file name? And then just basically hide an obsolete get temp file name?
I think we'd call it create temp file and return the file info, and then create temp subdirectory and return the directory info.
Yeah, at that point, I agree. We should just we should do the right thing in both cases by returning the file system object.
Yeah. So I
Though what's interesting is for create temp file, I feel like you probably actually want this file stream more than you want the file info, but file stream, I don't know if it lets you get the path back.
I think I missed the part for the object. Like, why is it better to return the object rather than the string?
Strings suck.
It's a strongly typed string.
Sure, but usually, the only thing you care about is the string, right? What are you?
You want to bring your browser window back up, Emo?
Oh, sorry.
I mean, it has friendly APIs on it, like delete when you're done using it, and if rename if you wanted to put a prefix on it.
Yeah, I guess.
Well, you shouldn't rename it because now you don't know it's unique. So yeah, I think taking a taking a prefix defaulted to null seems fine.
I mean, honestly, if we want to keep it on path, returning a file system object feels wrong, because I mean everything on path deals in strings. That would make the most sense. So if you want to do this, then I would rather have like file dot create temporary, right? And then directory dot create temporary, and then if they return a file system object, that seems fine. Or finer,
Yes.
I guess.
Because then they're factories for the objects that they're actually sitting on.
Yeah. But then they're also far apart, but I guess that's the design of the namespace already. So
that's true for file.exists and directory.exists.
Exactly.
But if you do both of them, I like it better than like go to path to do your get temp file name, but then go to directory for create temp directory, right? Like if we do both file.create temporary and directory.create temporary, then it's better because it's symmetric, at least.
I would agree with that. And I think then, to me, the only key thing is I don't want to live in a world where we have like substantially different mechanisms to do files or directories, right? So if we think I buy that get is bad. So if we feel strongly enough, I would suggest let's obsolete and hide this API and tell people like please use the other one to make it clear that you actually create a thing on disk. And I think the API is also not used that often. I mean, it's probably fine to do that, right?
I think if we're going to do that, we should.
Okay, I'm wrong. It's 50% of .NET Compat apps calling this API, but I don't know. Like it seems bad enough. I mean, on NuGet it's substantially less, but it's also libraries you don't expect them to. I'm actually shocked that it's 2.5% of NuGet packages create temp files, but yeah.
Yeah, working with
I agree.
Mm.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I agree. Get temp file name is a bad name. I don't know that it's worth like deprecating it and renaming it. Like it still has the behavior we want, right? To create the file. And then the question is whether to be like on path or directory. I do like having it like next to get temp file name. That's basically my 2 cents. So path.
I mean, we can do the soft obsolete, right? We could just literally hide the API and then just stop talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, also for what it's worth, we already have path.getTempPath. It returns the path to the temporary directory. Sorry, getTempPath returns the path to the directory. And so if we had getTemp directory, that would look a lot like getTempPath.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I still think it should be create temp directory and not like
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
and then sorry.
Yeah, I think the symmetry problem still exists, though, right? Even if you call it create temporary directory, it's not necessarily clear that it creates a nested directory, right? Versus
right. That's why we said create subdirectory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you put it on path, I think if you have it on directory.create temporary, I think it's
no. Well, again, create temporary makes it sound like it's going to delete itself. So it's create temp subdirectory. You are creating a subdirectory of your temp directory. Like, I think that's very important to the naming. Temporary should not be. That makes it sound like it erases itself to me, which it doesn't. I mean, if your temp directory is configured to erase itself on reboot, then it eventually erases itself. But it's not a disposable object that is going to erase itself. It's not a finalizable thing that's going to erase itself. You're creating a subdirectory under temp.
Right. If you wanted an object that would erase itself, I mean, you could always call the file stream constructor passing in the flag that says delete thyself upon disposal. Yeah. If we were talking about maybe improving, if we introduced, create temporary subdirectory and also gave it a prefix as an optional parameter, you could also take this opportunity to make those same improvements to get temp file name. Because right now I'm looking at the APIs, it doesn't actually take a prefix right now.
Or an extension.
Or an extension, yes.
I feel that
which is arguably more
people
important.
Call it and then say rename thingy from temp to dot whatever extension they care about, and that means it loses its guarantee of uniqueness.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I like the prefix for both. If we can do it.
Plus maybe a suffix also for create temporary file name.
Oh, I wouldn't call it. Would you go with
Extension.
suffix or extension?
Extension.
Yeah.
Can we make those APIs work on Windows, like with the prefix and suffix and all that, and have the uniqueness guarantees?
Oh, yeah.
I'm pretty sure Windows. I feel like what Windows does is it creates a buffer, fills it with random numbers, coerces them into be letters, and then asks if the file exists.
Yep, that's
So-
what it does in a loop until it finds it finds a hole.
We can glue things on the front and back of that. No problem.
So what was the name that you proposed, Jeremy? Directory dot create temp subdirectory?
Yeah.
And then what will be the corresponding one on file B?
File.create temp file. String question mark prefix equal null, comma, string question mark extension equal null.
And then presumably the directory only has the prefix one, right?
Yeah.
So how do we feel about this then?
Christoph asked about suffix versus extension in chat.
We could make it suffix, and if you want it to be an extension, you include the dot yourself.
I think I prefer suffix because extension implies it's doing some validation that it starts with a dot or something along those
Well,
lines.
With extension, I was going to say if it's not null, it adds the dot.
Yeah.
The POSIX API calls it suffix.
Yeah,
POSIX doesn't have extensions.
I think we should probably not include the dot if we were to do extension, because path.getExtension returns the extension with the dot.
Well, keep in mind this is an input parameter, so like
Fair
if
enough.
people put a dot or not, like we can do the right thing in either case.
We
Well,
could-
then the question is,
Unless
do
we
you
want to support not the dot.
Yeah, you want two dots
mean-
or do you want one dot?
Don't
Fair
do
enough.
that.
That's why
What it
it's
comes
better
down to is
just be
don't do that.
suffix. That's why it's better to just be suffix. It's here's what you want at the end of the file.
Yeah,
Fair
I
enough.
think-
So
I
if
think
we're
that's-
doing prefix and suffix on file, should it be prefix and suffix on directory?
I think so. At that point, you have it on both sides, and then you can name the directory whatever you want.
When do you ever want a suffix on a directory, though?
People are weird, man.
I mean, does make s temp allow it? There's
So
make
right, but in POSIX,
temp.
it allows a suffix for file, and there's no suffix for directory, just a prefix. Because it kind of doesn't make sense.
Why would it not
Because
make sense?
Because the end. Who cares about the end of a directory name, right? You care about the beginning because you want to sort them or look for something, right? You care about the end of a file name because extensions are a thing, even if they're not a thing.
That's fair.
Just looking at my temp folder on Windows, I see a whole bunch of randomly named folders that end with an extension that is not random.
Really?
Well, is that extension .tmp?
Some of them are .tmp.
Because that
Some
would
of
be
them
that
are
they
dot-
called path.getTemp file
Some of
name.
them are .dat.
Yeah, I guess for
Those
symmetry,
look like
I kind of like if you have it on both sides, but I also don't care too much.
And it's
Well, I think
fine
it's-
to do it on both.
Well, it just means that we can't call,
Right.
if suffix is supplied on Unix, we can't call the built-in function for it.
Well, we can when suffix is empty. Otherwise, you do the same thing we would do on Windows, right?
Yeah.
Which seems fine. I mean, like we have to write the code on both sides, right? And presumably that code is portable anyways.
It's kind of are people really asking or needing it? Like I get that makes it look symmetrical and nice, but it's like, well, is it necessary?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, to me, it's just I want to avoid the problem where we have one now and then later on we have to add an overload because somebody needed it and we just shrugged it off. I actually like it's two optional things. It's the same behavior on both sides. You can't really ask for anything except if you ask for something completely new, then
I mean, we didn't even have prefixes before.
Yeah,
Granted,
I'm fine
people
with
hardly
not,
used it.
yeah, I'm fine with not even supporting prefixes at all either. Like I'm fine with just literally like an overload that takes no arguments.
Yeah, but I feel like I've seen a lot of people calling, get temp file name and then either doing, that dot whatever extension they wanted or renaming the extension to be the extension they wanted. So I feel like messing with extensions and on files and possibly messing with prefixes on files is a thing that people do. And when they do that, they're using the API wrong. Well, because they may as well have just called create a file of whatever the name they wanted under path.getTempPath.
Yep.
Because at that point, they're losing the guarantee that the API was making that it gives you a name that was not in use until it finished. Now, because it's returning you the path or the file info or any of that and not the file stream, there's still no guarantee that the file was not in use by the time you get around to writing to it. But at least there was a guarantee that you created a file that didn't previously exist.
Well, I thought they both create the thing on disk, no? Oh, but they
Yes.
don't open them. Fair enough, yeah. So somebody else might open it and write to it before me. Yep.
Right.
Yeah, those are all jerks, though. They do the wrong thing.
Quick question. With both of these APIs, can the prefix be an absolute path?
No, I was actually going to say we should forbid path traversal characters for both the prefix and the suffix.
Yeah.
Because with the template for make the temp, I'm reading the man page. I haven't actually tried it, but it seems like it could be an arbitrary path.
Yeah. For those that you have to pass in the path, actually. Like if you don't pass in the path to temp in the template, it just returns you the template back with like an unbounded file name, a relative file name. Does that make sense?
Like the ability to create like a directory without having to like search for a slot myself in like an arbitrary directory. Like it is nice.
That's kind of not what this API is for, though.
Fair enough.
This API,
Yeah.
like both of these APIs are for like, I just need a scratch, either directory or file that I'm going to use for a little bit for whatever reason and then get rid of it.
I mean, generally speaking, like when you use the directory one, right, you have some logic that already does something meaningful, like let's say zip file extract, for example, right? And you basically, you're not really interested in creating subdirectories in one swoop. You usually call something else that takes a path and then it basically treats that target directory as this is my place where I can do whatever I want in it, right? So I don't know why you would ever want to create nested directories under that thing in one go. That seems
Well,
like an odd
I
case.
guess my primary concern is like we know with every single API we ever add to like path directory file, whatever, like people are going to pass arbitrary garbage input in for these parameters,
Yes.
like stuff that they just read from the wire. And now did we just give them like a new vector to do path traversal?
Yeah, I would agree with that it's bad.
Yeah.
So but I don't even buy the utility. It seems
So we just take them out. Let's just take them out. Let's
No,
take prefix.
no, I'm
Let's
saying
Take the
I-
prefix out.
I don't buy the utility of being able to put in fully
Yeah,
qualified.
I think
entries
that
there.
prefix is good on both of them, and suffix is good on temp file, and all of those inputs are going to throw if they contain a directory separator character.
Yeah, that seems reasonable
Yeah.
to me.
It's an argument exception to include a directory separator character in any of these parameters.
We should probably also throw for invalid args in general, right? If somebody puts an asterisk in there, that probably would be bad too, even if it's legal on Unix.
Well, when we
Everything's
go to
legal in
create the
Unix.
file, when we go to create the file, we would see if it contains illegal characters, right?
I guess that's true.
Yeah, I feel like the file.exists check in the loop on Windows is going to throw your path is illegal.
Yeah. Because
Except
they're
we
definitely
delegate to the file system for all of that now. So, for example, what happens? Would we allow you to create an NTFS file stream?
You mean like the dollar $blah suffix things?
Or the colon?
Yeah.
Date, yeah, because we're not going to screen for that, or are we?
Does files? If I create a new file stream, can I actually pass a colon now, and it would actually give me an NTFS stream?
I believe the answer is yes.
Cool.
My memory is hazy. I feel like we removed all that validation, or Jeremy removed other Jeremy, or one of the many Jeremys removed that validation several releases ago, and we just delegate to the OS and allow whatever it allows.
We are slowly taking over,
Yeah, I mean, I would say to me it makes sense to accept whatever we accept for, file.create, right?
Yeah, well, I think the problem would be if the extension contains the colon and you're talking about an NTFS stream, depending on how the exists loop works, I don't know that it, I don't know. I get something will happen. Who cares? But I do think it should block directory separator. And if you want to include a backslash in your path on Linux, go for it. I don't care. It's your nonsense. Deal with it. I don't think NTFS allows front slash characters and path names, but that's NTFS's choice, not ours.
So
you get a path exception if the OS says your path or the combined file name makes no sense, and you get an argument exception if it includes the current operating system's directory separator character.
Okay. So it sounds like we're kind of settling on block traversal, but everything else is fair game.
It's my vote.
And then we just need to make sure we don't go into an infinite loop. Sure.
Yeah, I don't remember if Windows does after 20,000 attempts just give up.
Yeah, it has a counter and it gives up, I think, after 65,000 checks.
That's still a long time. It's a lot of I/O that you can do.
It is, but I mean, eventually, your application's about to die at that point anyway. So it'll die quickly or it'll die after a few seconds of spinning.
One interesting thing to note is make dtemp doesn't take a suffix, but Python's version of it does. So I wonder if they're doing something like you were suggesting of just manually leaping through with suffixes for the temporary directory.
Yeah, it does also look like on .NET Framework getTemp file name is calling Windows getTemp. It passes TMP as a prefix, and I think the Win32 function always adds TMP as a suffix. So adding support for suffix on file is still easy on Linux and is a thing that people want, but it means that we have to move the OS loop into our loop on Windows, which is fine.
That's straightforward, yeah.
Is the sample correct where create temp subdirectory is on directory class, or should that be directory info?
Usually the convenience methods for files and directories are on file and directory.
I think I thought directory is static class.
It is, sorry.
It is.
They're not.
Oh yeah, those should both be static.
This is my mistake.
So, okay, so create temp subdirectory doesn't have a way to specify the parent folder, right?
It's
Parent
implicitly
folder is
under-
temp.
Yeah, it's basically implicitly the parent is path.getTempPath.
Same for both of them.
Yes.
Create temp file is also going to be in that path. Is subdirectory one word? Do we have that anywhere? Because I know
It's surely not 2 words.
I was gonna say, I definitely want it to be one word.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It would look so
File
bad.
System Watcher has it as one word.
Okay, good.
Directory info.create subdirectory is one word.
The only place that capitalizes both sub and directory is something from vb.core. So I think we can say that was wrong.
Your tool is awesome, Nemo. Keep up the good work.
System web configuration code subdirectory.
Emo wrote grep.
I think he's
I was using APIs.net.
like a civilized person. I would use grep.
Should there be a way to specify the directory? Like
No.
rather than using temp, you might want to use something else. I don't know.
Why would you want a randomly named directory under a path you otherwise controlled?
Yeah.
I don't have personally scenario, but I'm pretty sure there will be one person who will find a legitimate scenario.
So ASP.NET actually does have that scenario, but because in ASP.NET they control the directory that they're writing underneath, they also control how that randomness is generated, and they do it in such a way that it's appropriate for their scenario.
I mean, we just use quids and stuff right now for a lot of temp files.
But yeah. that's fine though.
You're right, yeah. But that is partly why, like, I brought up, like, hey, can I just use the prefix to put this in, like, an arbitrary, directory with a full path, or even, like, a relative nested path. But I see your point about that potentially being a huge security issue, and we've managed without it thus far. So,
I mean, if we want to expand them both just for full nonsense, it could be prefix, suffix, and parent, or prefix, suffix, and parent directory.
Well, it also means that you're bound by how this API would generate randomness forever going forward. Like, it is entirely possible that we change this API to include something like the application name or, whatever as part of the directory just for fun. And then we say, oh, we only need, 12 bits of entropy instead of 128 bits of entropy. And now all of a sudden, because we've changed how entropy is generated under the covers, we've now broken your application because you were trying to use that same assumption inside your own stuff.
yeah, I don't care too much about being able to create directories and other paths. Like, I do agree it's pretty niche. It is definitely still interesting to me that it's not that big of a deal, but that Python allows you to specify a suffix for its create temporary directory API. Just a note, because like seems kind of inconsistent to support it for the file but not the directory.
Yeah, I mean, since we're adding a feature that's going to mean we can't call get temp file name on Windows to create temp file because we know people want it, we may as well add a feature that makes us not be able to call make dtemp on Unix.
Yeah.
We can certainly optimize it because calling make dtemp means we only have to do one p invoke. So passing a null prefix will be faster on Linux.
Ish, right? It's all relative, I guess, because it all does I/O, right? I have no idea how expensive that other API is.
I guess that's true. The doing a 1,000 does this file exists, whether you have to go through 1,000 p-invokes or one may be the more expensive cost. So
yeah. But I mean, like, I don't know. Like, I think I've never had the scenario where I needed to be in some other directory. So I feel like we are somewhat feature creeping these APIs by adding more and more parameters to them.
100%.
The suffix
I
isn't
agree.
about, yeah, I agree. The suffix isn't about other directories, but I agree we're talking about marginal stuff at this point.
So then, are we skipping the directory? Are we just leaving it as is? Are we keeping prefix suffix?
I would say keep what you have on the screen here, and we block traversal.
Okay, so that's basically what I've written here. Okay.
Yeah. The question mark on prefix is in the wrong place. Christoph had pointed that out in chat.
I keep making that mistake. I don't know why.
I didn't notice it either. That's fine.
obviously you think it's a variant of a pointer. Oh no, wait. Those are still on the left. Just people who write C wrong. Well,
Apparently,
they write it
resharper,
according to what the spec says. Put it at the variable instead of the type.
apparently, writer or resharper have this feature where if you put the question mark after the variable name, they auto fix it. Because apparently, a lot of people are making the same mistake I do.
You're still wrong on file.
Of course I am, because it's copy paste.
Yeah.
See, I like consistency so much that I even do it by.
Consistent in your errors.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so diagnostics trace source. Actually, did I click approve? I don't think I did, right? I did not. I would have messed up my notes later. Trace source. Anybody here to talk about trace source? Steve still here?
Yeah, I can go over this. So yeah, you don't have to click on the original issue, but this has been a long-standing ask, is that people that are coming from .NET Framework, WinForms, WPF, use trace source a lot. And when they're using .NET Framework, there's support for automatically reading the configuration information out of your app config. So all of the trace sources and switches to turn things on and off and change the level and that sort of thing can be automatically configured for your app and easily changed, without having to recompile your app or anything like that. And it can also be changed at runtime. You can change your config and call a refresh method, and things will get updated. Anyway, so people really do miss this feature, and as of, 3-4 weeks ago, we have a proposed design for this. It wasn't done previously because there's 2 assemblies involved, and one's net standard and out of band, and one's not. So basically, this whole API, except for one method, is just to allow interactions, more or less, for internal code. And between these 2 assemblies, using events, and with a couple extra setters and things like that, to allow the config system to create these switches and trace sources.
So why, as part of that, do we need to make the attributes property settable?
The config system,
I guess on all of them.
And system configuration manager needs to create these types based upon the config file. And previously in .NET Framework, that code was together, so it didn't have to worry about this. Now they're in separate assemblies.
Is the string dictionary immutable? Why couldn't it just add to the dictionary?
I have to look at that.
Because our general guideline is collection properties should be get only, and that things should just add to them or clear them, but you should never replace them.
Yeah, string dictionary has an add method.
Yeah, so if it's possible to add to that without doing it up front, then that makes sense for sure. I'll have to take a look at the code to get back on that.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
Are all these APIs currently in .NET Framework? Is there anything added here that doesn't exist in .NET Framework? Like, is this purely effectively filling in things the full framework had? Because to be honest, if that's what we do, I would prefer to just keeping it exactly identical to .NET Framework, because that just gives us compat. I would rather not change names or change names at that point.
Right. So .NET Framework attributes is get only. .NET Framework value is protected. So I think what we have is, except for types that we're missing, is what .NET Framework has. And so making this be settable is deviating from framework.
Interesting.
Why is switch.value protected in the first place?
I guess because you're supposed to get it from the derived type.
It's not abstract though. Like, it's not virtual. It's
yeah, I guess the idea was that the derived type is redefining it with new and making it public.
Oh. Okay. Because I'm trying to reason to myself if making that public is a breaking change. I don't think it is.
Actually, that's a good question.
Because it's not virtual. If you're overriding it and the publicness changes, that's breaking. But this, being that this is non-virtual, I think you're okay.
Well, because you would have already seen in your hierarchy protected string value. If you tried adding public string value, you would have already had to say public new string value.
Mm-hmm.
So us moving it from protected to public won't break derived types. They would have already been, because they would have already had the same break.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure we have done this before on exception, right? Didn't we? I think exception age result used to be protected. I think we made it public.
I think you're right.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's really the colors will be fine, and the derived types, it won't introduce a new break. So it seems totally fine to do. The only problem with it is because we need it to be set by something in a different assembly when we used to not need that now it's publicly settable. And it used to be more controlled. But since it calls its on value changed anyway, things would already be hooking it the way they would have gotten when config set it. So it's fine. But there is, technically scope creep there.
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure. So what are we saying here? We are saying the attribute collections shouldn't be settable, or are we saying they should be settable?
They should not be settable. They weren't in framework, and guidelines say they still shouldn't be.
And then things like default value, refresh, they are all from full framework, or are they also new things? Actually, I don't know.
Which in framework, switch has a field called default value, which can be specified via a protected constructor. So, yeah, I don't know a reason why that would need to be gotten back out. Like if we're only adding the minimum API we need in order to make config loading work, I don't know why this would be part of it.
Steve, do you have more details on this, or is it somebody else's proposal that you?
Is that the protected one? Is that what you're referring to?
No, public string default value.
Uh,
On switch.
yeah. Again, I have to take a look at the code, but I mean, this was necessary, I think, in the implementation.
I mean, that literally makes no sense to me because field is private in the implementation and nothing reads it. Like,
well, I can look for
I mean,
code.
there's like the implementation of initialize with status reads default value, but nothing outside the class ever reads it. So there'd be no reason to expose it if we're just going for feature parity.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't quite understand a lot of these additions. I mean, you also have these event handlers. I mean, I think my question is kind of like if we like it sounds like what we're doing is we're basically adding a feature that existed in .NET Framework, which is the ability to read from app config, and that to me means we probably should just have the API service that full framework had. So I don't know why we would need more APIs. Is there a difference in the way app config works in core versus full framework that?
Yes.
That requires
so
these
that's
APIs?
kind of what the description said, is that there's two assemblies and one's out of band and one's not. And config, since it's out of band, can't take a reference, or sorry, the other way around. Trace is inbox and it can't take a dependency on an out of band assembly. So that means the config side needs to, subscribe to these events and create the system diagnostics side with the trace source and this sort of thing. In full framework, that coupling isn't.
Yeah, the way the major difference I think in app config and full framework is that in full framework, the subsystem that deals with app config is able to instantiate and talk to random types in the framework because the config system knows about everything. And in core, we basically decided that we don't do that anymore. So you can't use app config to customize networking or other things because we treated app config as this random thing on top that nothing knows about. So I guess you logically have an inversion here where you have to push data in rather than, pull data out rather than pushing it in, I guess.
Yeah, like all the events on Trace seem to be new.
Yeah, the events are there for the config side can subscribe and create the trace sources and switches and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I guess the way you intend this to use is that our out of band package would subscribe to these events, and then when somebody does something, then you basically read it from config, right? In order to get the data into the system. But then, okay, I guess that explains the events. That doesn't explain why the attributes need to be settable, because I mean you could just add them to the dictionary, I suppose.
I'll take a look at that. That was previously there, I guess, before I started working on this. As long as you can add to this, I think there might be some nullability there. I have to look at. It could be that those collections, even though there's some nullability missing. I don't remember if it's on the config side or if it's on the diagnostic side. But one side is not annotated. So I have to take a look at that. For the default value question that was brought up, yeah, the current code, when it in the configuration manager, needs to set value to default value if there's not a value specified in the config file.
But again, that I don't see how that makes sense because the current config system or the config system in framework couldn't have done that because it can't read the default value back once it's built a switch. I also am confused on the notion of the config system would need to ever talk about a switch that already existed, but
the config only cares about switches that exist in the config file.
I mean, do we have the same level of, or do we have the config refreshed while the app was running and that does things to the process? Because if we don't, then it seems like it just needs to build things once and it's finished.
No, it does support, if you call trace.refresh, there's an event here that is called, and the config site subscribes to that, rereads the config file and updates the switches and trace sources.
Right. The configuration system, at least in full framework, can be mutated while the application's running.
Fair enough. And as for chat, Frederick, I'm not saying none of the events are useful. I'm saying they don't match. To me, they don't feel like they match the description of we're trying for feature parity with .NET Framework.
Yeah,
it feels like somebody went, I need to do this one thing. Oh, let's go design a whole bunch of things and make a super rich feature around that. And if that's the case, my personal opinion is bring this back in 2 weeks when there's no chance it goes in 7.
Well, my concern with these static events is I am wondering if enough of the infrastructure would have already been hooked into them by the time that the events are supposed to fire. Like, my paranoia there is that people who need to see those notifications will miss them.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is not adding any new features that didn't exist in .NET Framework, and these events are required to initialize the state. So, you know, there's no creep here.
Yeah, I think to me, the key takeaway here is my understanding or my recollection of how configuration works in core is just that in full framework, the subsystems are able to call into config to effectively ask for data that is present in app config, right? But in core, we moved configuration from the bottom of the stack. We treated it as a legacy high-level optional component, which now prevents large chunks of the framework itself, like tracing or networking, to call into the app config to retrieve values, right? So I feel like maybe the fix here is not specific to trace. Maybe the fix is more like the other way around, where we have some sort of hookable API that we provide an entry point for in the BCL, like a delegate or something, then that you can then call into in your app to say, okay, I want to use app config configuration for this callback, and then things just magically work again like .NET Framework. It seems a bit weird if we now have to add new API service for every single subsystem that we want to support app config configuration for, just because we decided that app config is this high-level legacy stuff that sits on top of everything, right? At that point, we probably want some sort of core API where you can say, yep, wire in app config here. So that's the one line of code people have to do to support the legacy config system, but then we don't have to add APIs to everything to support that.
Okay, so trace as a subsystem is already like maybe 3 levels behind other tracing mechanisms, so it's already obsolete in that matter, and config is now obsolete as well. So we're really talking about 2 systems that are both obsolete and trying to get parity under .NET Framework.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the problem is that maybe I'm missing it, but isn't trace built into the framework? Isn't that a core API in core?
Right. But like I said, it's there, there's at least 2 different newer APIs that are recommended now. So this is only about really supporting people that have been using trace in the past.
Yeah, but that kind of makes my point. Like, I'd rather not have more APIs on trace then. I'd rather have some API somewhere where you can say, inject legacy app config configuration, right? And then all the systems like trace that want to know interface if that can do that, right? If that makes sense.
Well, the config system's not that open-ended. I mean, it already knew about trace to begin with, so.
I mean, like if a bunch of
I
this
guess.
API is being added to support dynamic and late, etc., reloading of config, as you said, this is an obsolete system. The config system is an obsolete system. Doing the work to get it to load once makes sense to me. Supporting dynamic reload feels like we're doing too much work for a thing that's not really not being invested in. Like adding these new static events makes things complicated.
It does. I mean, I why that? I mean, if we cut the refresh capability, it will reduce. I will get rid of the events, I believe. So
Because the easy scenario of
actually, I take
I
that.
have a bunch of stuff in config, I want you to just load that trace configuration. That I get. But I want to be able to dynamically rewrite the model during runtime and then have it go refresh from config. Seems like a weak scenario to me.
The only if we remove the ability to dynamically refresh, the only thing I think will be gone here is the refresh method, because the programming model is a little bit weird. It doesn't actually load the config and hook up everything right away. The API is that you new up a trace source and give it a name, and at that time, when you do that, as soon as you touch it, after that, then it will read from the config file. So you do kind of need, just from the current implementation and the way that you can new up objects wherever you want, new up trace sources wherever you want, is that you do need, kind of this callback mechanism to read it out of the config. It's not all done up front.
Yeah, I'm not sure I follow entirely. I think I kind of understand why you need more APIs on core. I don't understand how what the
Can you go
interplay of this is.
to the code sample? A little bit further down. Okay, so here we knew of a trace source and we give it a name. And you can do this anywhere in your code, in your WinForm map, for example. And as soon as you access a property on it, in this case, listener's property, then the config system will load that information for that, test trace source. So that's the reason for the events, and that's, and it's not done ahead of time because you have to wire up these things at runtime.
Yeah, so basically, this is the line of code that hooks to the events, right?
Yeah, this is the one that the configuration will subscribe to those 3 events, basically.
And so where does this API live here? Trace configuration? I mean, we don't put it in box, I suppose, right?
That's on the configuration side, but we put, it's on the configuration side. System configuration manager.
Right. So this will basically go into the OOB legacy package for app config reading, right?
That register method will.
Yeah. So I guess then the idea would be everything that we want to effectively glue framework code with app config, we would have to have some events in the box on those things, and then there would be some new API in the configuration manager legacy component to say hook those events to effectively read the data from the config system, right?
Right. There's a half dozen custom collections and that sort of thing that exist in .NET Framework that need to be moved into the config system. That specifically know about these, trace source sections and switches and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
they're all internal.
That's the whole problem, right? This is all like custom parsing and logic, right?
Right. It's XML.
Yeah, and the difference is in .NET Framework, it's all pool, right? The trace APIs just call into configuration like first time you access them, right? And in core we can't do that because the thing the thing is in box but doesn't know about app config, right? So you need this indirection somewhere.
Okay, so maybe the confusion that I have is that the events are maybe just poorly named, because like the static event configure switch, I don't That's what you want to happen, which means it's not what happened. So that event would be on switch created. Or switch created, if you don't want the on. Because the event should describe what's happening, not what you want to happen.
Sure. Well,
because I looked at this, and when the event is configure switch, that makes it sound to me like somebody changed the value of a switch, and you're now firing an event, which was not a previous feature.
Yeah, I mean,
so the poor naming here is making it sound like feature creep.
Yeah, well, I guess poor naming is hard to describe, but I think the question is, how do we? Like, I'm struggling with this notion where we effectively add all this complicated hooking, because all the hooking is kind of like one-offs, right? So tracing has this kind of hooking. My concern is the next component where we want to support legacy app config. We have the exact same situation where we invent a bunch of infrastructure to be able to effectively read configuration as we go, right? I guess what I'm asking is like imagine instead of doing all of this, we just take configuration manager and put it back in core and call it good, and then just do exactly what we do in full framework, right? Like that might actually have less API surface than doing things like this for every single legacy component that we want to support it for, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, like I said, the number of components are fixed in system configuration, and I mean I can take a look, but I don't think that scenario will happen. That there's another subsystem that people have asked for at least already, but I'm not aware of anything.
Yeah, if this is the last thing where we want to glue something together, then that's probably less API service than configuration manager, because I think that's all where all those strongly typed sections are as well, so it's kind of busy. But do you know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, it seems like we do a lot of dance in order to kind of keep configuration manager out of box, right? And I think the question is, if we were to put it in box, would it make our lives easier? Because if the only goal is to just keep it legacy, well, we can put it in box, put attributes on it, make it obsolete, have an analyzer for it, hide it, whatever, right? There's a million ways we can effectively de-emphasize an API. But it does seem a bit weird to like add net new APIs to legacy tech. And the problem is also the interplay with these APIs, because basically you have to hook everything. So by definition, all of those APIs are non-trivial, because you effectively expose kind of like construction phases of your inner components to a third party. But the third party is basically just you. So you open up this whole extension point that only one party is supposed to use. So it does seem a bit fragile as well.
Yeah, there's definitely compromise there. I mean, the original intent was to keep this surface area as small and as simple as possible. Prototyping, it kind of ended up what you're looking at here. Right. If we can remove the collection stuff, that'll simplify it. I mean, the main thing is this register method and the 3 events.
Right.
Everything else was, we could use reflection or something, I guess, if we really wanted to.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, if it's just 3 events plus the register method, I can probably say good enough. But yeah, I don't know. I think we should at least rethink whether configuration manager, like, I don't know, is this literally the only thing that needs it? Are we sure of this? There's nothing else that we want to add support for app config for at some point?
I can't say that, but I'm not aware of any other asks. And I can look at the framework code and figure out what sections were there that aren't there now and get back, to this issue on that. But like I said, I'm not aware of any other sections that people have asked for.
I'm glad we have an adult dating website here. That's good.
I was gonna say, we only get spam when you're hosting. But yeah, so configure switch should be switch created. Configure trace source should be trace source created. And I don't know what refresh configuration is supposed to be.
That basically gets called when you call trace.refresh, an existing method. It just needs to tell the config system to invalidate the caches. And reread the trace sources that it knows about.
Right, but I don't know how to turn that into an ing or an ed.
Oh, right.
Is it configuration
on
refresh requested?
Trace refreshing. Yeah, something along those lines.
Trace refreshing seems fine. To Frederick's ing events question, for switch and source, I mean, I guess that's true. If it's firing before the constructor returns, then I guess that would be switch or creating switch.
Switch created and trace.
Well, because switch created is what I had originally said, and trace source created. But if it really is you're touching an object that is in the middle of being created, then it is not actually created yet. It is creating. But I'm having trouble Englishing that. So,
I mean, isn't the normal event pattern that we try to have the ing or ed literally as the last thing in the event name? So it would be more like switch configuring and switch configured rather than configuring or configured switch.
I mean, if you care about before and after, maybe, but
before and after are forbidden.
Well,
no, I meant if you don't care about distinguishing before or after.
I think the idea is generally for events you have the subject and then the event, right? So mouse click, right? Not click mouse, right?
I mean we can say that created is fine, and that created means it has finished the object initializer but not the constructor yet, and that's a semantic argument we're willing to live with.
Right.
The switch was created. It's not yet configured, but it was created.
Right.
But if somebody then tried actually subscribing to this event because they wanted to see what switch got populated, if they beat the config system, then they would only see it as a default.
I mean, you could also put those on the actual type, right? So you could have literally like trace source configuring, right, so basically you would have configuring basically as the event on trace source and switch, right, rather than having them on trace. That also avoids the whole problem.
I guess it's true. I mean, you could have creating or initializing or any of
whatever we see fit, right?
Right. Well, because configuring is weird because we don't know that anything's going to happen. Like configure is not a verb that is being done. That's an action that someone or that the config API intends to do with this event, which means it's describing the wrong way. The thing that is happening is it is being created. So creating or initializing would be more the word that we would have for that, I think.
I mean, you could also get away with not having the event arcs at that point, because you could just say they're all event arcs, and then the sender is obviously the thing that you're configuring.
That's true.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that. Normally, you don't put the sender on the event args itself. Normally, the event args has things like the previous and new value, something that you can't get from the sender.
Yeah.
I mean, the args are here. There's a parameter, a Boolean parameter in one of them, but to make it strongly typed, right? Just so you don't have an object sender. Sender in this case would be null.
Right, but
that's not the pattern, though.
You're making events. They need to look like events. So.
I think the problem is because you're on the wrong type, right? So I think it makes sense when you're on trace. Like it's a bit weird that some of the events they give you a switch, some of them give you a trace source, right? So but if you put them on the actual type where they belong, it's pretty clear what the sender is, right? If you subscribe on something called button, right, then you expect the sender to be the button, right? And so I think that's the same here. Like,
I think the event guidelines are to create these args and have a strongly typed sender, isn't it?
No, sender must always be object.
No, I mean instead of an object.
No, it's you only make the args for things that are not conveyed by the sender.
To my knowledge, we have 0 events where the sender is anything but object. I think it's always typed as object. The only strongly typed things we have is event args.
Like, for example, on clicked, the clicked event args only has what were the X and Y coordinates.
Yeah.
If you want to know what got clicked, that's the sender.
Yeah.
But in that case, I mean, the sender in that case is a polymorphic type, right? So you're going to cast it anyway.
I mean, yes, but I mean, the reason it's always object is because most of the time you don't care about the sender, right? It's just normally you write code like if sender is blah, right? Or equals something, some specific instance. But I mean, yeah, in your case, it's a bit weird because it's kind of part of the contract, right? You're basically saying, the point of the event is to, do something with the thing that is being configured, right? That's very rare, right? In normal events, you don't care about the sender because, you hooked it up to an instance, right? So that is obviously the thing you're handling for, right?
Yeah, so I think it's public static untyped or non-generic event handler initializing on switch and on trace source.
Yeah, I think given that you're also the only consumer.
And then refreshing on trace to indicate that trace.refresh was called.
Right.
And there's no ancillary data that we would be able to provide via an event args that would help people make more informed decisions on whatever need be done.
Well, I don't know what this was configured is on the configure trace source event args. Does anybody else see blue squares dancing around that email screen?
Not today. Sometimes,
like
on
behind
other days,
configure
yes.
trace of yeah.
I do.
All right.
What's configured happens to be needed for the implementation. It's just a detail to say whether that trace source actually existed and whether it was initialized, or whether if it was found or not, basically.
Right, because if you need that information, then we need the trace source initializing event args, but
right.
But it would then only have the was configured and not also the trace source, because that's the sender.
Okay, so and that means we would get rid of the configure switch event args. Then that would just be event args.
Yeah. The non-generic event handler.
Right.
That would certainly be a more minimal API, right? So I feel like if you want to go down this path, I would make the API service as small as possible without being, deliberately obtuse. But to me, getting rid of the event args types and just saying cast sender seems reasonable if we move them to the corresponding types.
Yeah. And if the default values really, really need to be exposed, which, again, looking at .NET Framework's implementation, I don't understand why. Like they're, as Git only, they're not bad. It's worse that value is settable than default value is gettable. So.
Yeah, I'll take a look at that. I mean, the existing prototype does set that, does use that property. The trace source side, doesn't know anything about the config values. So I think, yeah, I'll get back on that.
Yeah, and if it's the case that it's the framework implementation was able to just go straight back into config and ask config what the default value should have been, well, then config should already have it. But Yeah, so I'd be curious to understand why it needs access to a member that was not exposed at all in framework. If it was internal in framework, I'd understand. It was that it was reaching sideways and asking about things it shouldn't have known about, but it was private, so I don't understand why it needs it.
Yeah, and to your question, I believe config does actually have a concept of default value for many of their elements, or many of their section attributes.
Right, but then it would be the config's notion of the default value, not the live object's notion of its default value, because that default value was just something passed in that construction time.
That I believe that's correct. Yes.
The current implementation of the prototype reads the default value only if value isn't set in the config. So it basically sets dot value equal to value, or default value if value didn't exist.
Seems like it would just say, if value doesn't exist, don't do anything, because the default was already specified. Because default value came from the constructor. And doesn't get reassigned based on anything out of config. So that seems like a bug in the implementation.
Should we just poke it back as needs work and give Steve some time to think about it?
I mean, I think we knew what the shape was, or at least I think I knew what the shape was.
Yeah, but I don't think it's about the shape. It's more about the viability of that shape, given that we inverted the dependencies, right? Because I mean, that's at least that's what I'm hearing from Steve, is that he says like he needed that in order to make that whole thing work to begin with. But he doesn't remember the details, right? Which is fair
for which one? Default?
Yeah, in general, like you exposed more API surface, right? Which I think is a result. I mean, some of them are the events, right, that you need to hook, but then there's other things that you need in order to push the data back in, right?
Right.
So that's why I'm saying maybe you want to take another look at the implementation to understand.
Yeah, I can go over that again, especially the collection setter. The default one. So I only have two notes here: the collection setters and the default value as being open for removal, I guess.
And moving the events to the types that issue them and renaming them to follow eventing patterns. So I think for trace, when creating a trace source and a switch, that would be initializing. And then the one that stays on trace, which is refresh, would be refreshing. Is my instinct.
Right, yeah. As far as moving things, right, that's a different set of feedback.
And then eliminate unnecessary event args types.
Right, that one event arg, we can remove if casting is the right thing to do for sender.
All right, should we just mark it needs work then and move on?
Personally, I thought we were leaning toward here's an approved shape if you can make it work, and if you can't, then it's not approved. But
I mean,
whichever way you feel like going.
I mean, I'm not sure I know the shape. I mean, basically, so what's the shape you have in mind, I guess?
So get rid of the attribute setters.
Okay, get rid of the attribute setters. Okay, so let me just.
Or get rid of the attribute collection setters.
Yeah, so just leave it as is, basically. Yep.
Yep.
Don't expose default value, I suppose.
My belief is if they're reading default value to assign it to value, that's a bug and they should just not be doing it. But maybe that is needed and can be squared with config, and that's minimal, and we can add it if it's actually needed. Then the events move around.
So hold on, does that mean basically there's no changes on switch then, right? Because if you get rid of this guy here, if we believe this is not necessary.
Switch presumably does need to move value from protected to public.
Okay, so we keep that.
And it may need refresh.
And then, all right, so let's keep that in there as well. Then, okay, on trace, I guess you would take the switch event, move that to switch, right? And make that just a regular event handler that's nullable. And we would control this, what, initializing or whatever?
Yeah.
All right. And then we would do the same thing with trace source, so I'd move the thing to trace source.
Yeah, it'll stay as a typed handler because it needs extra information, apparently.
But we would remove the trace source from the event args, right?
Yeah.
So we would just keep was configured.
Yep.
And
the event would be initializing.
And the event name would also be initializing, yes. All right. Then, okay, then on trace listeners, we remove the whole thing.
And then the last event on trace refresh configuration would be refreshing.
Okay, that's right. Refreshing, okay.
It gives you this happy taste in your mouth because it's so refreshing.
And then trace listener we just remove because there wouldn't be any changes in it, right?
Yep.
Trace source, we remove the attributes again. We leave default leveler supposedly, or would you remove that?
If it's absolutely needed. Like if it's needed, it's needed, and if the implementation can get away without it, then it should.
Okay.
And then we get rid of configure switch event args. We remove trace source from trace source event args, and I think that's the end of the proposal.
Sorry, I missed the last two parts.
Cleaning up the event args, but I think you'd already done it.
Yeah, so I have this right now. Does that look right to you?
I think so. I think that's what we discussed.
I guess the constructor would have to go right on the. You would just have a parameterless constructor, I suppose, in the event args.
Yeah.
So that would
which means you can just delete the line.
Well, I mean, I just described what the end result is, not what C# does.
Fair enough.
Or what C# needs, I guess. I document what C# does.
Yep.
All right.
Seems right to me.
I think the event handlers don't have nullable annotations on them, do they?
They do because they are null unless you assign something to them, right?
Because if you're inside the class, it'll see the field and then it argues that it hasn't been created yet. If you're outside, it sees the method, and the nullability doesn't transfer into the method because it's never allowed to be null there.
Okay, so as long as the outside caller sees the right thing, then we're good. Okay.
As long as the event handler annotations are consistent with what every other event handler gets, but I think they are because I don't think we taught the source or the Gen API that events were special.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
I thought all events were nullable. I think that was where we landed.
Okay, as long as it's the right thing, then it's the right thing.
Because I was looking at it, I'm like, but this can't be null, and then I remembered the nullability of that depends on if you're this or not.
All right, Steve, you're happy with that as well?
Yeah, I think I'll try to make it work. I'm looking at some of the event code, and I think it just is the way the collections are built up with the config system and then assigned. So it'll take some refactoring, I think, but it's doable.
Sweet. Are these last? I mean, this one is fast. Hopefully, this one is hopefully fast. Should we just brush over those two at least? And there's all the blocking ones to gone.
It's good with me.
If you want.
All right. Leo, I think this.
So this is the explicit proposal that was based on the conversation we all had last Thursday, which is, hey, how do we obsolete, or how do we make an analyzer which detects that you're calling, span operator equals or operator in equals? And we realized we need an API to get people onto, and if we want them to get off of the old stuff. So this is an API memory extensions.reference equal, and it tells you whether two spans have referential equality. Very straightforward, like it is basically operators equal. There is an interesting comment in the risks section, which I think is probably going to be more interesting to this group, and it is reference equal could imply that because a span is both a reference and a length, reference equal could imply that I'm only checking the references for equality, but not the actual lengths. And that could potentially be a bit of failure for people using this API. There were some alternative names, such as rsame. I don't necessarily like that because same and equals are probably equivalent to most people. I had proposed as an alternative range equals, because if you imagine that a span is a range of memory, then you're comparing that the ranges itself are equal rather than the contents of the ranges. It's all a bit weird.
Yeah, well,
but that's where
that one's weird because we have range, which is just a start and a stop.
Yeah, which this is. This is over the entirety of memory, a start and a stop.
I guess
that is a span. That is a span by definition.
I guess that's true.
I personally, if I heard range equals, I would assume that meant everything between the start and the end.
So you're thinking content equality as opposed to memory address
as opposed
equality.
To comparing the bounds themselves rather than what was between the bounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those were the three options that were part of this proposal. Reference equals. Again, the downside is, does it also imply that the length is equal? rsame, which I thought was too close to r equal, and range equals, which we just shut down.
Did you consider being super explicit, like ref and length equal?
Yes, that was one of the comments that was given here too, but that is very verbose. Maybe that's okay given how few people we actually expect to call this API.
That was what I was wondering. I mean, we basically said that it's almost never going to be used, and this is good. So we eventually want to obsolete the operators, and for the few remaining use cases, push them to this. Doesn't matter if the name is terrible for that situation.
I was going to ask, does this need to be that? It looks pretty visible, right? Like it's an extension method on span in the system namespace, so it's going to show up in IntelliSense a lot. Like, should this be like on memory marshal or somewhere more hidden? I mean, maybe not memory marshal, but somewhere that isn't right in my face when I type dot from a span.
You know, I actually kind of like that you see sequence equal and reference equal in the same spot, because it kind of conveys that is the difference that you can do with those APIs.
Yeah, Jan had just thrown in chat span equal. I don't know how I feel about that because like span dot equal is basically what you had typed, and that's basically what we're obsoleting.
I mean, honestly, I think reference equal is fine. Like, I mean, the layman's interpretation of reference equals is basically, does it point to the same location, right? And so if you think of a span as basically 2 pointers, right, for start and an end, I think that's kind of what you would expect this to be, right?
Because to go with your straw man of rsame, in XUnit, rsame is object.reference equals.
Yes.
Yes.
Like, is this span and that span the same span? Okay. Then that means they're loosey-goosey reference equals.
I mean, to me, honestly, like seeing sequence equal, reference equal, to me, kind of that describes, in my opinion, like the two ways you can interpret this. And it may not be the best way to describe it. I mean, maybe same would be more, compact, but reference equality is the thing that we use throughout our documentation to express that concept, right? So I think as a name is as precise as you can be without being like too verbose.
And two spans that have both the same start and the same length are, for all intents and purposes, identical.
Right.
They're like black holes. They're expressed by their radius and their spin, right?
Yeah, and I also wanted to call out that this is a pattern for span, but since we're getting ref fields, and since there are other libraries out there that are defining their own span-like structs, or will start defining their own ref structs that carry a ref field, they're going to want a similar name in scenarios where that matters. For example, the community toolkit provides a span 2D for two-dimensional span data. So I think reference equal ends up being kind of the nicest name that implies what we want, even if there's one minor confusing edge case, and that would be a good thing for the ecosystem to normalize on as the name here.
Yeah.
Okay. That also is an argument against and length as being part of the API.
Yes.
Because length is specific to span, but not specific to what Tanner had just described.
Yes. I think this is an example where naming the concept is more valuable than trying to.
Yeah. So the one thing that, or I guess two things I'll point out. One, on object, it's called reference equals, but matching the tense of sequence equal is probably more valuable here. And two, for asking if two ref fields are the same ref, like the same ref target, the API for that one we did call rsame. That's unsafe.rsame of t.
What would we call the future API hypothetically that does just compare the refs in the span to see if they're pointing to the same memory, overlapping potentially?
Overlaps.
Dot overlaps.
But that's different. That factors in length. Like overlaps would factor in length because you could have different refs and still overlap.
Well, because knowing that you have the same start would be overlaps produces 0, or you can get the ref to span of 0 and ask unsafe.rsame.
I mean, I would just call it reference equal and just overload on the second argument and just give it a ref t and call it good.
Sorry.
No,
what?
I'm not talking about passing in a ref. I'm talking about I have two spans. I want to know if their ref is the same. I want to know if their reference is equal.
Yeah, because right now the way that you would do that is unsafe.rsame, memory, Marshall, get reference A, get reference B.
Span dot.
I'm not saying we should add it. I would have used reference equal as the name for that thing.
Expose unscaped ref or unscoped ref t, a value ref get.
Well, that's one way. I mean, we can also just have a method like, start reference equals or something like this, or.
I mean,
yeah.
Start is reference equals or.
Same ref, but like.
Same start.
That's true. Because that's actually the question, that asking, are there refs the exact same, and I don't care about the length, is same start.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, we could confuse everything and call this shallow equal, but
yeah. So are we then okay with that name here, or?
I think there is mild room for confusion, but that it's probably the best name.
I personally would be confused without context.
Feel free to kick it back if you'd like, and we can iterate on the name until Tuesday.
If everyone else thinks that's the best name, that's fine. I'm just saying it may be that I know too much, that I know span contains a ref. So asking whether their references are equal, which is how I read this name, suggests to me that we're comparing the refs and not the lengths. But if everyone else sees it differently, that we're actually comparing them as objects effectively.
I mean, I'm fine with, especially since I'm 2 of the 3 callers that we think should be using this. I'm fine with, same start and length. I don't think we should call it same ref and length because the NetFX version doesn't use a ref, but name it for the concept instead of the implementation. So, like, I'm fine with a foofy name.
Yeah. So one of the proposals in here was our same. I had maybe rejected that a bit too quickly, but do people feel okay with that? Like, my concern with that is, especially for non-English speakers, same and equals are basically equivalent.
Even for English speakers, like the distinction that XStudent makes here is arbitrary.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think to me, same is kind of like it's kind of like saying dog versus four-legged animal, right? I think same is a more specific version of equals, right? The problem with equals is it's kind of like what kind of equality, right? Versus same really implies it's the same object, right? So that's, I mean,
Are identical?
yeah, I mean, I mean that's how it's called in object-oriented programming, right? It's the identity of the object is the instance, right? But I think the question becomes, you know, what terminology have we been using so far, right? I mean, we could also call it range equal, right? I think the problem that I have with anything but reference equals is that the naming is now specific to spans, right? So we'll have the exact same discussion on the next object.
No, but why is that bad?
Well, because
a kind of reference equality that we're defining that is specific to some. We're saying two things are the same if they have the same reference and the same length.
Why did we not just go with dot equals span?
But there is an equals operator on span, and it's obsolete.
Well, the equal operator is what we're trying to avoid. The fact that it doesn't describe the thing. But if we have span has dot, if you see on span dot equals and dot sequence equal, like there are two notions of equality here, and one of them says it's about, like, yes, maybe you have to look at the docs, but one of them says I'm about the span itself, and the other says I'm about the contents that the span is expressing.
Keep in mind that when people are rewriting their code from string to span of char, for instance, dot equals is on string is content equality, on span is obsolete.
Yep.
I believe is error.
Yep. That.
In pretty much in all cases where we have play tricks where double equals and dot equals are not doing the same thing, it's kind of a pit of failure.
No, because this would still be doing what double equals does. But part of the reason for marking it obsolete is if you have an input parameter that is string and you rewrite it to read-only span of char, equal just changed meanings.
Yeah.
And so that's why we said we wanted people to stop writing equal, but then be more clear if they're calling dot equals or. But if they were calling dot equals on string and then they called dot equals on span, they would still be changing their semantics because we did value equality instead of reference equality because it made sense at the time.
Yeah, I guess my larger point is that if we think double equals is bad, that would equally apply to dot equals, in my opinion. Like I don't understand why people would think that double equals is bad, but dot equals is fine. Like because
dot equals we've already obsoleted.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we obsoleted it because we didn't add the one that took a span. We only have the one that takes object, and span can't be boxed. So we just said like you can't get here.
Yeah.
So Jan commented in a different chat than the one associated with this, and I like his comment, which is if we really believe this is going to be super duper rare and general folks shouldn't be doing it, we already provide a way to implement this yourself. Is that insufficient?
In what way is that? Just suppress the analyzer and use the operator?
No, suppress the analyzer or don't use the operator at all and extract the ref and compare the length.
How do you extract the ref? Isn't that unsafe?
Unsafe.rsame memory_marshal.get reference.
Yeah.
Does memory marshal get reference get the real reference, or does it get the null normalized reference?
It gets the real reference. It is unsafe.
Okay. So the reason why I don't like it is because I think we want to make the analyzer actionable, right?
Yeah.
In theory, the analyzer, the 99% case for the analyzer is it's actually you're doing it wrong. You're using the wrong method.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, we don't want you using the operator. It's you're using the operator for the wrong purpose.
Yeah, I guess I get that. I still think it's easier to explain if you say, like, there's two ways you can do equality. You either compare the values or you compare whether they point to the same thing. And I think it's easier to explain to say there's two methods for them, and you pick between them, even if that means 99% of people will only ever call sequence equals.
Yeah, I mean, Jan in the channel chat gave also span equal of t. And
I have the same problem with span equal that I have with range equal and same. To me, it doesn't in any way suggest to me that it's not comparing the data.
Yeah. I think span equal to me sounds exactly like sequence equal. And arguably
sequence equal, span equal, range equal, they all sound to me like they're comparing the data within that area.
Okay, so
location equal.
So yeah, is identical to we talked about earlier too. Like if two spans have the same start and the same length, they are indistinguishable from one another. Therefore, they are identical.
Yes, but that also leaves the question of, are two spans that have value equality but not reference equality identical? And that becomes it depends.
Well, changing one changes the other, then they're identical.
So yeah, I guess that moves me to same start and length or range equal, because that's what range means. We're being foofy and saying that start is of anywhere in memory.
I mean, honestly, if we would have sequence equal and then just same start and same span, I think that would work for me.
So you think same span conveys that it is comparing the ref and the length.
If presented as a basically, if I see same start and same span, or let's say same range, I think I would come to the right conclusion. But I'm also okay with saying we call it same start and length. That also works.
Same start is not a terribly useful API by itself.
Yeah, I think the other issue is discoverability.
I mean, yes, I agree with that, but I don't know what else to do.
Like, yeah, we could do nothing. And we could tell people pragma warning suppress, as was mentioned earlier.
I'm still struggling with the idea that we expect basically no one to use this, but it's really important to add it.
We don't expect no one to use it, but we expect relatively few people to use it.
I think the thing is that the core concept here, the important thing is that the operator equals are confusing, and we should probably tell people don't use this.
That's fine. I have no problem with that.
Yeah, and then this API proposal came out about because we wanted something actionable for them to do, something that they could actually use as a code fix or to replace their code with. That way they could transition to reference equals if that's what they needed.
Yeah, I guess I like the idea that when they start typing equals, IntelliSense comes down to two choices, sequence equal and whatever other thing we have there, right? Because then I think like you're presenting the user with, you have to make a decision. Here are the two ways you can do equality, and pick the one that applies to you, right? Because that's, I think, the goal we have, that people think about.
I mean, we have that today.
No.
It's use the operator, and if we want to have an analyzer because you're 99% of the time doing it wrong, we suppress it, or you call sequence equal. And if we want to have something in documentation, if you're the 0.1% or whatever that needs this, you call unsafe.rsame on the two references extracted with get reference. It just seems, I don't know. I don't know why we're. Yeah.
We have a solution in search of a problem.
Yes, because like what I don't want to do is put this in any way on equal footing with sequence equals, which we all agree at least 99% of people want to use.
Yeah. Now, so if we honestly think that the best answer is if you need span equality, that you just suppress the analyzer, then we can revisit naming it later when people complain. But of the places that we looked and found it, I think 2 of 3, and I'm fine suppressing the analyzer.
Yeah, I found one use in regex, but I think that's a bug. And I have a chat with some other folks on that.
But in the PKCS 12 KDF, the spec makes a distinction between the null password and the empty password. And so I need to check, did they pass me in null? And I can't use is empty because I would give the wrong answer.
Yep.
So I equal default to find out if I'm actually null. And then the other place that I know that I use it, which I think I counted as the two places that I use it, is in a test of there's an input memory and an output memory, and I assert that the two spans are equal, that this found exactly the memory that I gave it. And that's those are the only two places that I've come across that I needed it.
Yep. Okay, so it sounds like we can just know off this for now, and then it's a problem for future us.
Yeah, if it's more than just me, then we'll come up with a name later. But we are still leaving anything that wants to do something span-like with, are you the same span versus are you the same data when it's not a reference type is still an open problem.
Yeah, I guess I disagree with the notion that just because the API is rarely used, it doesn't add value. To me, the value is in the presentation of the alternative.
Mm-hmm.
That to me is the logical concept that I think we don't want to hide. And I feel like if we say you need to suppress or use the operator that we don't want you to use to begin with, it does seem like you don't really discover it. You don't really see them as presented as alternatives. You just see them as fundamentally completely different mechanics to do related functionality, which I think is not conducive to learning or understanding.
So you think that contrary to Stefan's point, where he thinks it shouldn't be in your face, you think it being in your face is useful because it tells you need to make a choice.
I think the idea that equality just works is just clearly wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing we learned the hard way, right? Based on Levi's examples, right? Right, you port from string or from byte arrays, right? And then your code has a certain mechanic to do it, and then that's wrong. And so when you use spans, you have to think about what kind of equality do you want. And we can't, like, to me, this is a conceptual problem of the domain that we want people to understand, because it's not an implementation detail. Like, it's an implementation detail on how the span it represents the range, but there is the concept is it expresses a range in memory, and yes, two ways you can compare them, either by just, are they pointing to the same location, or are they, having the same data in them, right? And there's very different operations, and depending on what you want to achieve, you need to make the right decision for those, right? And I feel like when we say there are different mechanical ways of doing it, you're just making it harder for people to understand that there are these two ways of doing it. And it might not even be two things, right? To Stephen's point earlier, it's like we may want to also say, like, maybe you only care about whether the start is the same, right? So I think it makes sense to have a naming convention that is conducive to that. But I think reference equals start might be good enough, right? Because then you just type equal, you see all three pop up, and then I guess the doc comments or the naming explains which one does what, right? But I mean, I'm okay with saying we can do it later, right? But I think I just disagree on the notion that just because it's rarely used, it's not important. To me, it's about, like, what kind of mental picture are people building as they're exploring APIs in IntelliSense, and for those things matter.
Oh yeah, but it is, because we don't have any use cases for is same starting reference in our own code, like we would just kind of have to take it on blind faith that it would be useful to people.
Yeah, I mean, I can see why it would be useful, but I'm just saying, like, the pattern that we have here, it would allow you to grow into that if you ever needed it, right? Because that was the concern that I think Stephen had, is that, I would call this one reference equal, so let's not call this one reference equal, right? And I'm just saying, we could make that work too if we wanted to.
I also don't think that it's.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, I also don't think it's blind faith for some of these APIs. Some of these are core concepts, which if you're thinking about something from a completeness perspective, or from the perspective that we are the BCL, they are something that a corresponding types in other languages, other frameworks, and other runtimes have already vetted and proved are useful in various scenarios, and that they do provide. I do not buy or agree that we 100% have to have a use case, a direct use case for APIs we expose when we're talking about the core primitive things and operations of the runtime and framework itself, and when they correspond to things that only we can provide.
Sure.
But
I
I
guess
don't see why there's usefulness in knowing I have the same start but a different length as I was. So slice 0 to hat 1 versus slice 1. Like, to me, those are the same level of importance, and one of them you would have to call overlaps on to get the offset of 1, and the other one you would have this special extra method for. So
this is also not something that only we can provide.
Yeah.
Right. I guess what I'm getting at is, like, if you care that the starting reference is the same, but you don't care about the length, you've almost certainly called get reference on each of them already, because you've already clearly indicated you care about the starting reference. So if you already have both starting references, just call our same.
Right, but this API we're discussing also compares the length.
No. But there were two things stated. One is, do they have the same ref? The other is, do they have the same ref and length? And then there was the ref only one doesn't seem to make sense. That's we would wait for someone to say why it's important.
Okay, yeah, I got confused then, because I thought we were discussing whether or not the ref plus length comparison one was worth exposing at all.
Right. The blittable value equality that equal is more or less doing is an important concept, but I think the answer is we're not coming up with a good name right now. The use case we have for coming up with a name right now is the analyzer we talked about on Thursday, and that if we aren't coming up with a good name right now, then we can say that for that degenerate case, the analyzer tells you, if you really meant blittable value equals, then suppress this warning. And that's the action you take if you're the 3 call sites that matter right now. And maybe next release we come up with a name for it. So I don't think this is close, but I think that this is, we're not going to, every name we've come up with, somebody dislikes at equal weight. So I think the answer is we're not going to get the happy, we chose a name and got it in at the last moment for 7.
Sure. That's fair. Just punt it back as needs work.
And we can call it blittable value equals, but now I'm the only one who can remember that.
Is span blittable?
Is splattable.
Splattable.
No, see, splat has a different meaning in programming. Splat is broadcast.
Yes.
If we exposed a span splat, I would expect that it would take the given T and replicate it to all entries of the span. It's basically fill.
Fair enough.
So, Emo, how was that for this should be a short review?
Well, sometimes that's what happens.
If Steve was still on vacation, it would have been short, because it's the name we agreed to while he was on vacation. It's not saying it would have been the right thing to do, but it would have been short.
Yeah, the indication was not there that it would take that long. All right, this one is hopefully easy. So we approved obsoleted in-OS platform attribute. And the feedback that I guess Jeff and Booyah had was that the other ones are not named like this. The other ones are called supported OS platform rather than supported in-OS platform, and unsupported OS platform rather than unsupported in-OS platform. And so the question is, should we just rename this to obsoleted OS platform attribute? And I didn't have a good answer for that. So I'm curious what you guys' take on this is.
So to me, grammatically, the in is correct, because you can ask something like, is Mac OS a supported platform for this? But you wouldn't ask, is Mac OS 10.14 an obsoleted platform for it feels way more contrived there. And supported platform, we expect to just say Windows, Linux, right? We feel that the case of this only starts being supported in Windows 11 is rarer. So we're usually in the other ones talking about an entire OS family, and here we're talking about a version. So I think the N makes sense.
I don't buy the grammatical distinction between obsoleted and supported. I think they're grammatically the same.
Yeah, I think they're grammatically the same as well, and I think that over time, we're going to find more and more APIs that are this only starts on a specific version. When we created supported an OS platform, we kind of got this nice baseline of Windows 7. And we've yet to pick up a lot of new Windows 11 APIs and such. But when you start looking at WinForms or other products like maybe even Avalonia, where they are definitely relying on platform-specific behavior in some cases, or trying to expose platform-specific functionality, it very much becomes this is only supported in a particular OS platform version. I'm actually using these attributes in TerraFX to help disambiguate. This is only supported on Win 10 version blah and above for interop bindings I'm exposing. So there are definitely use cases for it, and I think we're going to find more of them over time where this is supported in Windows 10.10240 and higher, and then obsoleted is just the inverse question, was this obsoleted for platform?
So would you then say we should rename the existing ones, or should we rename this one?
I think we should just rename this one to be obsoleted OS platform, and then supported OS platform. I always find the in an API name to be a bit odd. It's extra typing for something that, while grammatically correct, isn't necessarily grammatically relevant.
I kind of agree with that. Like it always throws me off a little bit. I mean, it reads like, to me, the reason why I thought obsolete without the in was weird is because you're not obsoleting the OS, right? We are just saying that the API is obsolete on this OS, but I guess that equally applies to supported, right? It's just that the adjective has a direction that kind of looks from the API standpoint, versus in the obsolete case, you clearly look at it from the OS point of view, right? So it's a bit of it probably doesn't matter, but I like the symmetry, and I think it's easier to rename this one than I guess the other one we can't, because
the other one's shipped.
Yeah, the other one is shipped, so never mind. So that one, so we can only rename this one here.
Fair enough. I don't know. To me, it reads more natural with the N, but I'm fine speaking developerese. It's a language I'm fluent in.
That works.
Do we actually have a set of APIs that we're going to put this attribute on? Because I don't see it anywhere right now.
So the reason we added this was specifically for the Apple platforms, because they have this notion of deprecated and obsoleted, except their notion of obsolete is what we would consider, now I have to think about it, unsupported, and their notion of deprecated is what we would consider obsoleted. So basically deprecated means you shouldn't use it anymore, but you can still use it. The API is there. Obsoleted means the API doesn't exist on the underlying OS anymore. / you can't submit to the store with that, or something to that extent. So basically you literally can't use the API. And so we project that as unsupported, but we don't have a projection target for deprecation. And so we said, like, well, but their understanding of deprecation is what we consider obsolete. So we projected this as this one. But they haven't done the work yet. So I don't think, if you look at the Azure, at the macOS or iOS SDK, I don't think they're using it yet.
I wonder if we should, next version, go paint all the CAPI interrupt stuff with obsoleted OS Windows 7. Sorry, Windows 6, because they obsoleted it in Vista.
Yeah.
I mean, you might guess.
Just to help people be like, you shouldn't be using this. But no, I think that'll just make life painful. The Mac one, I think, has a real situation because Apple, unlike us, has shown that they're willing to delete things.
Yeah. Alrighty, so then we are done with blocking stuff. The only thing that we have left is this guy here, but I think we want somebody from the WinForms team here anyway.
Yep.
Cool. Then I think I see you guys next Tuesday. So I canceled the Thursdays because we're done with the craziness.
Cool.
Alrighty. Have a good one, everyone.
Sehr toll.
Bye bye.